Hello again. Electric cars are, in the modern world, still something of a novelty. The technology they use is not as familiar as the trusty old internal combustion engine, and some people regard them as unreliable or even dangerous. Aren't they prone to bursting into flames? Many people prefer to rely upon old and well-known means of travel, the petrol-driven motor car. This is actually very funny because 120 years ago, people were saying precisely the same thing when being urged to abandon their electric cars in favour of those powered by those newfangled petrol driven engines. We like our history to be neat and easily understood, and so we have devised a mythology about cars which runs something like this. In the 19th century, vehicles were pulled by horses, and then slowly but surely, petrol cars, lorries, and buses took over and rendered the horse obsolete. This is, of course, absolute nonsense. It is true that by the end of the 19th century, horses were on the way out, but they were not being replaced by vehicles powered by petrol. Instead, electric cars and steam cars were seen as the future. Let's consider a few facts, starting with the land speed record as the 19th century drew to a close. The land speed record is the highest speed attained by a person using a vehicle on land. Railway trains do not count. In 1898, the land speed record was 39.24 miles per hour. The following year, it had crept up to 65.79 miles per hour, and by 1902, it had jumped to 75.06 miles per hour. The interesting point is that the first two of these records at the end of the 19th century were achieved by electric cars, and the one in 1902 by a steam car. At a time when most of us imagined the internal combustion engine was forging unstoppably ahead and overtaking the old horse-drawn transport, electricity and steam were actually at the cutting edges of developments in self-propelled vehicles rather than petrol engines. Two targets in particular entranced early pioneers of speeding cars. One was to develop a car which would travel faster than any train, and the other was to break the 200 kilometres an hour barrier. In 1906, the car reached the astonishing speed of 128 miles an hour, a little over 200 kilometres an hour. This was faster than any railway train at that time. It would be over 30 years before a train exceeded a speed of 200 kilometres an hour. The car which smashed through those two barriers on the 26th of January 1906 was powered by steam. Still, it may be argued, perhaps specially modified or adapted steam cars or those running from batteries might be able to perform in this way, but surely on the roads most cars were using internal combustion engines. Not a bit of it. As the 20th century began, almost 80% of the cars on American roads were not fitted with petrol engines. The figures are, to a modern reader, quite unbelievable. 40% of cars at that time used steam engines, 38% were powered by electricity, and only 22% relied upon internal combustion engines. In other words, over a third of the cars were electric cars. In the race to replace horsepower, the petrol-driven internal combustion engine was lagging far behind. The most popular and best-selling car in America in 1900 was the Columbia electric runabout, which was also incidentally the first American car to reach sales of over 1,000. Even those whose business was to predict future trends were wholly unable at that time to foresee the inexorable rise of the internal combustion engine. This was the case in Britain just as it was in America and the rest of the developed world. With electric cars, taxis, and buses, to say nothing of steam cars, which were breaking the land speed record, how could anybody know that petrol driven cars would one day conquer the world? To understand why the internal combustion engine nearly failed to become the favoured method for propelling vehicles of all kinds, we have to go back to the 1880s and 1890s to weigh up the relative advantages and disadvantages of the different kind of cars on the roads. When we do so, we'll see exactly why petrol engines were seen as being so unpromising at that time. One of the chief problems to begin with was that early cars fitted with internal combustion engines were forever breaking down. Unlike steam engines, which have been around for a century and undergone continuous development and refinement over the whole course of that time, engines running on petrol were novelties. The technology was new and the teething problems were many, varied, and significant. It must be borne in mind that when we talk of internal combustion, we really mean internal explosion. When compressed petrol or diesel vapour ignites, there is a sudden bang. Modern vehicles are fitted with a complex system of mufflers and silencers and sound suppressors, and we tend to forget they're being pushed forward by a series of violent explosions producing loud bangs. But those early cars didn't have such things. They sounded like machine guns being fired as they travelled along. They were also very noisy, very smoky and smelly. There was also anxiety um, about their safety because they entailed travelling along with a tank containing gallons of highly inflammable liquid. A lot of people were nervous about this. We hear the anxieties now about electric vehicles and the batteries catching fire. People were terrified at one time that all that petrol being driving around with a tank of petrol under you doesn't sound terribly safe. Electric cars were clean, quiet, and they sounded like the future of transport. Apart from the semantics of the word, the cars themselves were quiet and reliable, unlike the petrol cars with which they were competing. Nor did electric cars have that air of vulgarity about them that the internal combustion engine brought to mind. Those driving an electric car didn't find the need for goggles, gauntlets, scarves, and caps, the sort of thing associated with the motor car at that time. They were altogether more genteel and sophisticated. This, too, worked to the advantage of those selling them. Quite a few members of royalty and the aristocracy, both British and European, drove electric cars. Such people wouldn't have been seen dead racing around in a noisy, smelly petrol-driven car. In 1901, the year that Queen Victoria died, the City and Suburban Electric Carriage Company published the name of some of those who had purchased their cars. Queen Alexandra, Edward VII's consort, the Dowager Empress of Russia, the Marchioness of Ripon, the Princess de Blagnac, Prince Demidoff, the Duke of Sutherland, the Earl of Derby. The list of noble names was a long one. Selling one of their cars to the Queen of Britain was a really smart move on the part of the City and Suburban Electric Carriage Company because it enabled them to put the royal coat of arms on their publicity material, beneath which was a legend by special appointment to Her Majesty Queen Alexandra. The electric cars which were on the market at that time had specifications which might do very well for a little smart car for use in the city today. The top speed of 25 miles an hour wouldn't prove too much of a handicap in London traffic, and the range of 80 miles, which some models promised, compared fairly favourably with modern electric cars. It meant that one would be able to drive from London to Oxford easily enough without recharging the battery. The batteries on which the cars depended could be recharged in around 3 hours. Looking at the exhibitors in the automobile exhibition held at Crystal Palace between 30th of January and the 7th of February 1903 is a disconcerting experience. Some of the names are recognisable. We see Daimler and Wolseley, but also the names of companies which produced only steam-powered vehicles or electric cars. The City and Suburban Electric Vehicle Company had a stand there, as did Brush Electric Engines, Electromobile, and Thornycroft steam wagons. Any visitor to the automobile exhibition that year would not have been able to guess which sort of cars would be the big thing of the 20th century. Steam and electricity would have seemed just as likely as internal combustion engines. Electric cars had already been around for decades when the automobile exhibition was held in 1903. Sales were slow at first for several reasons, not least of which was that domestic electric supplies were not common. If your home was lit by gas and it wouldn't be in a position to, you wouldn't be able to plug in your car and recharge its batteries. This problem too had been thought of, and it led in 1901 to the first example of a very modern kind of building, the multi-storey car park. The City and Suburban Electric Carriage Company had a 7-storey car park built at 6 Denmark Street in London's Soho district. Motor cars were at that time so rare it had never before occurred to anybody it might be necessary to have special buildings of this sort to park them in. This multi-storey car park was used to keep the cars belonging to people who didn't have electricity in their homes. They could be charged there overnight or left for weeks or more if needed. For a small additional charge, the company would deliver the fully charged vehicles to the homes of their owners. The rarity of mains electricity was certainly a limiting factor in the popularity of electric cars, though. Since they ran on rechargeable batteries, these would need to be changed regularly when they ran down for fully charged ones. Without sockets in one's home, it was a little difficult to run such a building. You've got to remember that in 1910, only 2% of British homes had electricity, and it wasn't until after the end of the First World War that this situation began to change to any great extent. Electric cars were popular in America as little city runabouts, similar in many ways to the smart cars of our own time. They had low maximum speeds and limited range, but for city use, these were not major disadvantages. It was the discovery of huge new deposits of oil which brought about the decline of the electric car in the last few years before the First World War. Once cars with internal combustion engines were cheaper to run than battery-powered ones, then the writing was definitely on the wall. More and more roads leading from city to city were now being well surfaced with macadam, and that in turn opened up the opportunity to use cars not merely for gadding about the city streets, but for long distance journeys. This was where the limited range of cars which needed to have their batteries charged for hours after travelling just 60 or 70 miles began to have a serious disadvantage. With a car fueled on petrol, it took only a few minutes to fill up and be ready to go. This is, of course, a problem with which we are now becoming familiar once again. The current suspicion with which electric cars are being viewed is no more than history repeating itself, the same theme, only played in another key.